Hello everybody, this is Philip Jonas at Kalamazoo Valley Community College presenting OpenStax Principles of Economics. And today we're covering section 3.3, Changes in Equilibrium Price and Quantity, the four-step process. In this module, you will learn to identify equilibrium price and quantity through the four-step process. Graph equilibrium price and quantity, contrast shifts of demand and supply and movements along a demand or supply curve, and graph demand and supply curves including equilibrium price and quantity based on real-world examples. In general, when we want to analyze the impact of a change in an economic factor on a market represented by demand and supply, we step 1 start out by graphing the market in its current condition before the economic place takes change. Step 2, decide whether the economic change we're analyzing affects the demand or the supply curve. In the previous module, we learned about the list of factors affecting each, so now we got to go through that list and see which curve we're talking about. Step 3, the curve that's being affected, shift it into the correct direction. Depending on if we're talking about an increase, we're going to go to the right, decrease, go to the left. And finally, once we've shifted the curve in a direction, we of course end up with a new intersection, a new equilibrium. And that means both price and quantity have changed. So we'll want to compare that to the step 1 prices and quantities and see what sort of increases and decreases we are predicting. Let's start out with an example of salmon fishing. So, there's been good news for salmon fishing. We had some extraordinarily good weather that makes it easier to get lots of good fish. What's the likely impact of this on the market for salmon? Let's start out by graphing this market before the change took place. So let's say prior to the weather improvements, salmon was selling at $3.25 a pound and 250,000 fish were being caught. Now we are being asked to predict the likely impact of an improvement in natural conditions. So, step number 2, let's go through that list of factors that can shift supply and demand curves. Where do we find changes or improvements in natural conditions? Well, that's a production side change. So we are going to be talking about the supply curve. It's very important when using the four-step process that you distinguish between factors that affect supply and demand. You will see in a second how one curve shifting moves us along the other curve. But first, let's get to step number 3. Natural factors or conditions affect the supply curve. Which way does an improvement go? Improvements in natural conditions increase the supply for a product. So we'll want to represent that as a shift to the right of the supply curve. Let's take that supply curve and move it way over to the right. There we are. We can already tell, well, we're about to end up with a new equilibrium. Again, let me emphasize the ceteris paribus assumption here. The demand curve is unchanged. Of course, there is going to be a change in how much salmon is being bought, but we're not referring to that as a change in the demand. That's a change in the quantity demanded. As the increase in supply leads to a new equilibrium price. You can already tell that equilibrium price is going to be lower than the previous one. Let's say it falls to $2.50. We end up with an increase in quantity demanded at the new equilibrium. So let's compare the prices. Improvement in supply leads to lower prices. Let's look at the quantities. Improvement in supply leads to an increase in quantity. So in other words, when we look at that increase in equilibrium quantity, that represents an increase in quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Quantity supplied and demanded move for different reasons. We've got our supply curve moving way to the right. That's a big increase in quantity supplied, but not in equilibrium at that old price. And then price falling, taking away a little bit from that increase in quantity supplied until we're at the new equilibrium. Still higher than the original quantity supplied though. Number two, we've got our demand curve. No change in the position of the demand curve. But as price falls, quantity demanded increases. That's our law of demand until we've reached that new equilibrium. That's our first example. An increase in supply with a very specific set of numbers. But you can use the logic underpinning the model of demand and supply even without any numbers in the picture. Here, we've got a completely abstract demand and supply model. Let's say it represents the market for print news existing at some current equilibrium price and quantity. We are being asked to predict what is the likely result if more and more people get their news in digital form rather than print form. So we have a change in tastes here. Let's go back to our factors that affect supply and demand. This is not a story about the production of print news having been fundamentally changed. This is a story about change in tastes. Those are demand side. So step number 2, we are looking at a change in the demand for the product. Step number 3, which way is that demand curve going to go? Well, we are talking about a taste shift away from the print news. So if we're graphing the print news here, that's going to be a decrease in the demand for the product, which is of course a shift to the left. Let's go ahead, take our demand curve and shift it to the left. You can already tell we are going to end up with a new equilibrium. But an equilibrium, of course, is a point representing 2 coordinates. So we want to describe that equilibrium both in terms of its impact on the price and the quantity of the product. So over on the price side, we have a decrease in price. Down on the quantity side, also a decrease in quantity. So in the previous example, the salmon, price and quantity changed in opposite directions. Here, they're changing in the same direction. That's why we always want to look at them separately. Once again, let's contrast between a change in the demand curve itself moved, while over on the supply side, no change in the supply curve itself, but a decrease in the quantity supplied as a consequence of those lower prices. So these were 2 examples where one curve is shifting at a time. Now, let's go to a more complicated example where 2 factors are taking place at the same time. So let's say we're talking about mail. Good old-fashioned first-class letters. And we are being asked to identify the likely impact of two things happening at once. Number one, consumers increasingly preferring to use digital communication, so there's going to be a change in the taste for first-class mail, while simultaneously mail delivery being hit with a big cost increase. Let's say we pass a law that puts really big requirements on retirement funding for our postal service. So let's start out by looking at these two economic factors in isolation. What if my story was only about a change in the cost structure of our postal service? So we're going to make it more expensive to deliver mail. So that's going to be supply side. That's going to be a leftward shift. In isolation, if only that were to take place, real straightforward, we predict price goes up, quantity decreases. Now let's look at that second factor in isolation. So again, starting position. Let's say we are only talking about a taste change leading to less demand for mail. So we grab that demand curve, shift it to the left. If that was the only thing that was going on, we would predict prices fall, quantity also falls. Okay, mini recap. We had one factor in isolation that makes quantity fall but price go up. Second factor in isolation that makes quantity fall but price go down. So what if both of them happen at the same time? So from our original equilibrium position, let's shift both the supply and demand curves to the left. There's a lot going on this graph. So in other words, we're moving from equilibrium 0 to equilibrium 3. Now, both factors in isolation decrease quantity. So if we stack them on top of each other, both a decrease in supply and demand, there will definitely be a decrease in quantity. Those two factors reinforce each other. But over on the price side, our two changes push in opposite directions. Decrease in supply tends to raise prices. Decrease in demand tends to lower prices. If we knew the exact magnitudes by which the supply and demand curves shift left, like we might be tempted to on this graph, because when you graph something, implicitly you're saying, I know how far this thing has moved, we might think we know which factor dominates and which way price moves. But if this is just a graph where we're discussing this in the abstract, hey, supply moves left, demand moves left, we don't know how much, then you wouldn't know which effect is stronger, price up or price down. Which means part of the art of using the model of demand of supply here is to be able to distinguish between what we can make a strong prediction on and where we have to say, well, in the absence of magnitude information, we are uncertain here. So in this specific example, if both supply and demand decrease, you should be able to say, certainly quantity will fall. But price, I am uncertain. I cannot make a prediction without more data. It is always the case that if you move both the supply and the demand curve without knowledge of specific magnitudes, that you should be able to predict the direction of change of one of our two variables, price or quantity, with certainty, while having to say that you are uncertain about the other one. Let's just discuss in the abstract some of the scenarios we might encounter. So here now we have two supply curves, two demand curves, so that we can talk about a number of different shifts. The one we already talked about was if supply and demand decrease, so going from E0 to E3, certainly quantity decreases. Price? Not so sure. Let's do another example. Let's say we're going from E1 to E2. So first of all, why would that happen? To go from E1 to E2, we would need an increase in supply shifts to the right, and a decrease in demand, going from E1 to E2. Both increases in supply and decreases in demand put downward pressure on price. So going from E1 to E2, price definitely gonna fall. But they push in opposite direction when it comes to quantity. Increases in supply tend to increase quantity, decreases in demand tend to decrease quantity. Both happen at once. We are uncertain which way quantity moves in the absence of additional information. Let's do one more. Going the other way from E2 to E1. We can have a decrease in supply mixed with an increase in demand. Both of those tend to rise price. Price is definitely going up. Quantity, uncertain. As you gain practice with this model, you will start to be able to distinguish between what you can predict with certainty and what you cannot. And that concludes section 3.3. In this module, you learned how to identify price and quantity through the four-step process, how to graph equilibrium price and quantity, how to contrast shifts of demand or supply and movements along a demand or supply curve, and finally, of course, graph demand and supply curves, including equilibrium price and quantity, based on real-world examples. I will see you next time.